So thanks for joining us on a summer's evening. I know the temptation to go out and about a bit more post-lockdown is there. So we really appreciate you joining us, but it's for good reason. We've got a killer book and a great lineup and some fantastic members. So thanks for being with us. BSG, tell us who's on the lineup tonight and what people can expect.
Got a really good bunch of speakers. So we're going to kick off with Dr. Monique. I will let her tell you all a bit more about her work, but it's possibly the coolest PhD title I've ever seen in my life. We will then be joined by Ben Anderson, who is an amazing promoter, has worked directly with Stormzy at the sort of inception of his career, as well as a load of other amazing artists. And then Kieran, who is a very forward-thinking journalist. So he does a lot with GQ. He actually did Stormzy's cover interview with GQ. As well as being a journalist, he's an author and has a really interesting forthcoming book around drill music and its influence on culture. So yeah, really good kind of triple threat lineup of speakers to join us and share some wisdom this evening.
So tell us a little bit about you've been connected beyond this book to this scene for a long time. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I guess this was the first subject matter in a while where I felt very comfortable, more so than nuclear power. So it was nice to see this one win. My kind of day-to-day away from all things non-fiction is in the world of music and work with a lot of artists, including like some of Stormzy's team, but a bunch of other people, some names you'd know and some names you probably wouldn't know. So yeah, it was really cool, kind of have seen from a distance his journey. And I remember as a consumer first seeing sort of freestyles dropping and him appearing on tours. And there was a whole summer where he was clearly beyond the size of the festival stages he was on, and it all just happened really quickly. And from a consumer perspective or a fan perspective, you just see these things happen and you don't often really get to peek behind the curtain as such. So yeah, it would have been any book that won this month, I think would have been a really good insight into what happens behind the scenes and what really, like, we see the one artist right headlining a massive festival. In reality, behind the scenes, there's so much work that goes in, and yeah, it's really the team that speak volumes. And it's very rare those people actually get put on a platform that's outside of something quite niche in the music industry. So yeah, really cool to get an insight. And I think the learnings with this book are so much broader than music and can be applied to anything really. It's just a great story of a bunch of people with a shared vision who came together and made it happen and are really only just getting started. Love to hear a bit more about yourself. I said in the intro, you probably had the coolest PhD title I've ever heard.
Thank you.
If you could tell us a bit more about what you've been up to over the last few years and kind of your background in the world of music and grime and culture.
Okay, so where do I begin? Well, my PhD, if I can remember the title, PhDs always tend to have long titles. So it was called Hallowed Be Thy Grime, a musicological and sociological analysis of grime and its relation to Black Atlantic religious discourse or something like that, some jazzy title. But I wanted to do a spin on Hallowed Be Thy Name because I was interested in music and religion or spirituality. So my journey, I started off a long time ago as a wannabe singer. So I was always interested in music and that sort of thing. But I'd also like studying. And so after finishing my master's in 2007, looking at hip hop, I wanted to study more, as you do, I guess. And grime was this thing that was kind of happening and moving. And I heard a bit about it. I'm a bit older than, I suppose, maybe the average grime fan. I came up with jungle, garage. That was kind of my era, so a bit older. But I saw this movement happening, and I thought, there are no books on this topic. There is no scholarly work on this topic. So when I was doing my master's and I was looking at hip hop, there's all these academic scholars, academic sources, it's in universities, all that sort of thing. And I thought, there's a gap here. On top of the fact that politicians were condemning, Black and working class youth, blaming everything on gangster rap, which they kind of all, put all of that underneath one umbrella. I thought, no, let's do an intellectual shut up. So that's what I did, really. So 2010, I started my PhD, and it was an interesting journey. People didn't understand why I was doing it. The thought at the time wasn't necessarily ready to kind of unpack it as a social movement, or necessarily even seeing the cultural value, because it came from a working class kind of situation. And so I just got my head down, put the work in, tried to get interviews with people, which was also challenging in some ways, because people didn't understand why I wanted to do this. Was I the feds, or you know, all sorts of different things going on. But yes, eventually, you know, 110,000 words later, the PhD was done. And one of the things that I hope that my work will do, it tends to look at the older part of grime, but one of the things I hope it has done and will contribute towards is bringing, you know, grime and other British music forms into the academy, so it can be taught at universities alongside, you know, the classics or classical music and all the other sort of stuff. So yeah. So grime has always been political, even though it hasn't necessarily always seen itself as political, or maybe it did, but didn't articulate itself in an overtly political way. So if we look at all of the different kind of facets that kind of happened at the turn of the 21st century, you know, you've got, you know, the MP3 coming in, you've got grime coming up alongside the internet, which it's kind of unheard of, you know, it was unheard of at the time. Many genres either came up before, not necessarily alongside the internet, which enabled it to expand. You had the polyphonic ringtones on your phone and PlayStation, so the ability to make music, it was much, much easier. And if we look at I suppose, the big picture, the wider things that were happening, the introduction of ASBOs that would target Black and working class young men in particular. I mean, women were also affected, but young men, you know, the introduction of tuition fees, all these sort of things that were kind of closing off the social mobility, which was the buzzword in, you know, the early Labour scenario. All these things were starting to kind of be rolled out. These technologies, this internet enabled people to kind of make a scene and make something for themselves with the resources that they had available, to the point where politicians eventually, a couple of years later, was like, all these young kids, it's all really bad. So they've you know, a massive movement had happened, and I felt like it needed to be documented. So the songs may never necessarily have been overtly political then, but what was actually happening was political. Culturally, it was important because, you know, early 2000s, it was, you know, 50 Cent, it was Rough Riders, it was all American-based music. I mean, if you're from some of the big cities where it's diverse, you know, depending on, well, whatever your ethnicity is, if you had Jamaican, or I don't like the term Afro-Caribbean, but Afro-Caribbean people living nearby, you may have heard some of the dancehall or the bashment sort of music, the kind of the rumblings of that in various cities. But for the most part, musically, in the mainstream, if we were thinking about Black music, it was American based. And so culturally it's important because for the first time consistently, people were spraying bars in their own accents, no fake American accents. There was still pepperings of Jamaican patois, but it was ownership. We are here, we have arrived, we're building on the British underground music scene, and we're doing it our own way. So politically and culturally, there was a lot happening.
Amazing. No, I remember as well when you were talking, the 696 form sprung to mind. And for anyone that's not aware of that, it was essentially something that the police would use when there was an artist who was considered dangerous playing a show, and they'd put this form out, which essentially would mean I had this as the promoter. I tried to book gigs in 2007 or 8, so kind of early days. We had a show, and essentially the police just said the whole thing can't happen because he's considered a risk. And we had DJs who were playing far more risque music that would lead to certain behaviors and stuff. But yeah, it was really crazy to see how the sound was so oppressed. And kind of following on about the cultural and political impact, having done so much in sort of the hip hop space as well, did you see many parallels? I know, like, I remember when the film Straight Outta Compton came out and sort of retold the NWA story, and there were a lot of parallels. I remember a lot of the grime scene getting behind that. What are your thoughts in terms of how it's manifested itself in the UK versus something like hip hop in its infancy in the US?
Okay, so if we're going to get all theoretical now, there's a really brilliant woman. Have I got the book? I mean, I have the book, but I don't want to start roaming around the office. A brilliant book by a woman called Jennifer Lena, who talks about genres and how genres develop over time. And in the early stages of a genre, she calls it the avant-garde period. That is usually where people live, artists and creative people can live together in close proximity, rent is cheap, and they can be creative. Now, if we think about, music in Compton, we think about music in, London's inner cities, or, any kind of inner cities, even if we think about like dancehall or ska, reggae, all these genres kind of come from these inner city areas where people are in close proximity together, making use of whatever technologies or resources they have available to them, and reinterpreting sounds that they may have heard through these new technologies to create something new. So in some respects, there are kind of theoretical or systematic things that tend to kind of happen to create this new sound, and then a scene comes with it, because music is the sound, but it's also the people that come together. So it's sonic and social. So yes, there are definitely parallels, and the lived realities are translated into the sound to kind of connote that lived experience as well.
Amazing. And I think Emily,
how is it different? So it's different sonically. It's different in the sense that because there are people connected, I suppose, into the music industry a bit more, but because of that resourcefulness and the quickness with kind of taking up with technology, the connection from a lot of the stars to the fans because they came up in those same spaces, it's able to respond quicker. Again, that could be the technology as well as the closer connection between like star and the fan in many cases. I don't even know if I'm answering the question. I can talk forever, so I'm not sure if I'm giving you what you need. But
that was great.
It's different, and the shifts.
Yeah, it's still very DIY, right? And I think your metaphor or meme of jumping off a cliff and working it on the way down is still true today. Like you say, people are just so hyper connected, and it's a different game, right? You see artists break, they get a few 100,000 views on a freestyle. And actually, if you look at even, obviously, Storms had put out a mixtape, and then it was a freestyle that went viral and charted. And it kind of felt like, from an outside perspective, he hadn't been touring for years. He sort of catapulted himself into culture and then did a really good job of maintaining it and building and growing from there. And from what you know about kind of Stormzy and the Merky story, is there anything that stands out?
I think the idea of, I suppose, the collective, I suppose Grime is a crew game anyway, but the kind of the collective vision, the working closely together, the idea of creating a legacy it strikes me as very legacy minded. So this whole idea of the publishing, the scholarships, and I suppose one thing with Grime, it does kind of have, there is definitely a brand consciousness that comes with it, especially as he was one of the first to be sponsored, if not the first to be sponsored, with that, all the Adidas stuff and everything. It's very legacy minded. It has a kind of social, I don't know if it's social justice is quite the right word, but it has kind of like a social outlook. It wants to kind of give back and use its position to, I don't know if you want to say level the playing field, or provide opportunities or spaces for alternative voices to kind of come through and be heard as well. So I think that's really, that's a slight nuance that is really, really important and valuable.